Hello friends, how are you feeling tonight? I hope your body is relaxed and your mind is calm. If sleep feels far away, this story might help you drift gently into rest. Tonight, we're traveling back to 17th century France, to a world of marble corridors, silver fountains, and endless gardens blooming under the golden gaze of a king. But this isn't the story of Louis XIV himself. It's about the quiet souls who shaped his paradise, the hidden gardeners of Versailles. They rose before dawn, when the air was still cool and the stars still trembled in the mist. They trimmed roses for royal banquets, polished fountains until they sang, and tended trees so perfectly aligned that even the wind dared not bend them. While the court above danced in silk and music, these humble hands worked in silence, turning earth, water, and sunlight into beauty that would outlive them all. So settle into your bed, take a slow breath, and let your mind wander to that distant morning light spilling across the marble terraces, where the scent of lilies floated in the air and history bloomed quietly beneath royal footsteps. If you enjoy this journey through forgotten time, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more bedtime history, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? The first light of morning crept softly over the marble terraces of Versailles. It did not rush across the gardens, but glided gently, brushing statues, fountains, and long rows of perfectly trimmed hedges with a quiet golden glow. A thin mist clung to the lawns, shimmering faintly as the day began to wake. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, listening to the soft stirrings of life beneath the stillness. The gardeners emerged from their small cottages near the orangery, lanterns in hand, their faint light trembling against the cool morning mist. They were not courtiers in silk or powdered wigs, but the quiet hearts of Versailles, men and women who had learned to read the subtle rhythms of soil, water, and air. They moved softly along the dew-dampened paths, their boots pressing lightly against the earth, their hands gripping tools smoothed by years of careful use. Every gardener knew the paths and plants as if by memory, understanding that each hedge, flower, and fountain was part of a larger design, a living system of symmetry and grace that required patient attention and delicate care. The youngest apprentices walked alongside their mentors, eyes wide with wonder, observing the way sunlight touched the petals of early roses, how the fountains began to sing as water moved once again through the polished channels, and how every leaf, no matter how small, had a place and purpose in this intricate mosaic. Etienne, a gardener of 30 years, paused beside a row of pale pink roses. He traced the curve of each petal with a finger, feeling the cool dew, adjusting the trellis so the morning light would fall perfectly across the blooms. A nearby apprentice knelt among violets, watching how the sunlight played on the delicate leaves and listening to the gentle murmur of water trickling over stone. They understood slowly that beauty was not in the eyes of the king alone, but in the quiet care given by countless hands unseen by the court above. The air carried the subtle scent of damp soil and fresh herbs, mingling with the faint fragrance of lilies and roses that had opened in the cool of dawn. The gardeners spoke little, exchanging only small nods or soft directions, their voices blending with the hum of water, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional call of a waking bird. It was a symphony of quiet labor, a harmony of human care with the natural rhythm of the gardens where every movement had weight and every gesture mattered. Children followed closely, learning to notice the little things. The tilt of a stem, the direction of the sunlight, the shadow cast by a trellis at different hours. They began to understand that tending Versailles was a dialogue, a conversation with soil, water, air, and light, teaching patience, reverence, and observation. By mid-morning, the palace remained silent, but the gardens had fully awakened. The fountains sparkled with captured light, hedges gleamed with dew, and each flower seemed to bloom with intention. Etienne walked slowly down a row of marigolds, adjusting the soil around each plant, so that roots could spread evenly and water would reach every corner. Apprentices carried buckets, moving with care to avoid trampling tender shoots. The gardens were a living poem of lines and curves, of symmetry and surprise, shaped not by grandeur alone, but by devotion and quiet hands. Some gardeners paused to admire the distant view, where the rolling hills outside the palace framed the estate in gentle curves. The elders spoke softly of perspective, reminding apprentices that a flower could only be understood in the context of the larger garden, just as the garden existed within the sweep of the horizon. Every decision, pruning, planting, watering, was made with a sense of balance, ensuring that no flower overshadowed another, no hedge interrupted the harmony of lines. As the sun rose higher, shadows shifted across the fountains and gravel paths, revealing new angles and possibilities. The gardeners adjusted carefully, nudging trellises and realigning flower beds so that the design remained true from every viewpoint. They worked in a rhythm, alternating between movement and observation, learning that the garden was alive, responding subtly to touch, light, and wind. A young apprentice learned to follow the patterns of the fountains, noticing how droplets caught sunlight and threw tiny rainbows onto surrounding petals, creating ephemeral beauty that would vanish as the sun climbed. Lunch came quietly, beneath the shade of trees whose leaves whispered in the soft breeze. The gardeners rested briefly, exchanging muted stories of past seasons, the flowers they had tended, and small successes or failures of the morning's work. They sipped water and nibbled bread, always keeping a watchful eye on the roses, the fountains, and the vegetable patches for which they were responsible. The conversation was gentle, never rushed, filled with soft laughter, and the shared understanding that the beauty of Versailles relied on patience, care, and quiet attention. Afternoon brought more subtle tasks. As light changed and shadows shifted, each hedge and flower bed required re-examination, adjustment, and meticulous pruning. Children who had watched silently in the morning now tried their hands, guided by patient mentors. Etienne knelt to demonstrate proper trimming of a rose bush, explaining how each cut encouraged growth in a measured, deliberate way. The apprentices followed, learning that control and gentleness were both necessary, that care could not be hurried without loss of beauty. The fountains and water channels required constant attention, for even a minor misalignment could interrupt the flow, creating imbalance or stagnation. The keepers of water moved along stone channels, adjusting valves and checking levels, listening to the whisper of moving water, learning to treat it as a partner rather than a tool. The youngest apprentices watched, learning the value of listening and observing, understanding that Versailles was not created by force, but by dialogue between human hands and nature's subtle designs. As afternoon gave way to evening, the mist began to return, wrapping the gardens in a soft cloak of silence. The fountain's hum slowed, the shadows lengthened, and the flowers seemed to close gently in preparation for night. The gardeners walked slowly through the terraces, inspecting each section one last time, adjusting leaves, straightening trellises, and smoothing paths. The young apprentices learned to carry their tools lightly, to move with attention, and to respect the stillness that preceded rest. In the quiet hours before sunset, Etienne and his companions paused at the central fountain, gazing at the sun reflecting off water and marble. They shared a quiet understanding that the beauty of Versailles was fleeting yet eternal, a delicate balance of effort, observation, and love for the living world. The apprentices absorbed these lessons, feeling the weight of responsibility and the joy of participation in something far greater than themselves. As night approached, lanterns were lit to guide the gardeners back to their cottages. The mist thickened, and the gardens held the last warmth of the sun, glowing softly beneath the fading light. The palace remained silent, unaware of the tireless hands that had shaped perfection below, hands that would rise again at dawn to repeat the quiet ritual, continuing the cycle of care, beauty, and devotion that defined Versailles. In this rhythm, in the quiet heartbeat of early morning and fading light, the apprentices learned not just how to tend a garden, but how to move through the world with awareness, patience, and reverence for subtle beauty. They discovered that the true power of Versailles lay not in gold or grandeur, but in the delicate, unseen labor of human hands in harmony with earth, water, and air. Louis XIV awoke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the tall windows of his private chambers. Though the gardens below were already alive with the footsteps of his devoted gardeners, the king lingered in bed for a few quiet moments, feeling the warmth of the morning sun brush his face and listening to the distant song of fountains echoing across the terraces. He had always believed that beauty could be measured, controlled, and perfected, and Versailles was the living proof of that philosophy, a grand statement carved from stone, water, and carefully tended earth. The king's gaze often lingered on the gardens, imagining each hedge, flowerbed, and fountain as a stroke on a canvas, a note in a symphony of light and color. He would rise and walk along the marble corridors, his mind tracing invisible lines across the terraces, calculating symmetry, balance, and proportion in every space. He expected nothing less than perfection, yet he rarely saw the toil behind it, the quiet devotion of hands that shaped every corner of the estate before he even appeared. The gardeners, aware of the king's exacting eye, moved with a mixture of pride and reverence. Each hedge must stand at the proper angle, every flower aligned so that its bloom was visible from multiple perspectives, and all fountains had to flow in precise harmony with the sun's path. A single misaligned trellis or drooping rose could disrupt the illusion of effortless beauty that the king cherished, so every action was measured, deliberate, and executed with care. Etienne, experienced in both the art and science of garden maintenance, often contemplated the king's vision while tending the central flower beds. He understood that the gardens were more than decoration. They were a statement of control, an extension of the king's power expressed through living things. He trained the apprentices to see beyond individual plants, teaching them to understand patterns, lines, and the subtle interplay of light and shadow across the landscape. They learned that every choice in planting, pruning, and watering contributed to an overarching vision, one that demanded patience, attention, and a quiet understanding of nature's rhythms. Morning inspections were frequent, for the king would often walk unseen along corridors, observing the gardens from hidden vantage points. The gardeners moved like shadows, adjusting blooms, straightening pathways, and smoothing gravel to maintain the flawless impression expected from royal eyes. Children who had grown accustomed to these routines began to sense the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that their hands and decisions mattered in shaping not only flowers, but the very perception of the king's perfection. The fountains themselves were works of engineering as much as artistry, and the keepers of water were as vital to the king's dream as the gardeners who tended roses and tulips. Water had to flow with consistency, pressure had to be maintained, and channels had to be cleaned and aligned to reflect light just so. When sunlight struck the fountains, it scattered across petals, gravel, and marble in patterns that seemed almost magical, a subtle trick of engineering and devotion that Louis XIV admired, even if he did not know the names of those who labored to create it. Midday brought lessons in alignment and proportion. The king believed that a true garden reflected the cosmos, that every hedge, flower, and path should be in harmony with both human perception and natural law. Etienne would gather apprentices around the Grand Canal, pointing out the symmetry between its reflections and the surrounding terraces. He explained that even the smallest variation could disturb the visual balance, that a misplanted flower could ripple through the observer's perception, diminishing the effect of countless hours of labor. The apprentices learned to see the gardens as a living canvas, where each stroke of pruning, shears, or careful placement of soil contributed to the larger vision. They studied the lines of trees that guided the eye toward the horizon, the gentle slopes that framed hidden fountains, and the placement of statues that drew attention without overwhelming the senses. Every action was measured against the king's ideal of order, yet there was room for creativity within constraints, a delicate dance between obedience and artistry. By afternoon, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across gravel paths and flower beds. The gardeners adjusted trellises, moved potted plants, and recalibrated fountains to maintain the harmony Louis XIV desired. The apprentices discovered that understanding light and shadow was as important as understanding soil and water. A bloom beautifully placed in morning light could appear dull in the afternoon if angles were misjudged. The king's vision demanded attention to time as well as space, teaching patience and mindfulness in every task. The king himself sometimes descended to walk among the gardens, unseen by all but a few attendants. The presence of his shadow was enough to quicken the pace of gardeners, yet he moved slowly, examining details, noting proportions, and adjusting his own thoughts about the harmony of the estate. He did not rush. He believed that perfection could only be achieved through careful observation and repeated refinement, a principle reflected in every hand that touched the gardens below. Evenings in Versailles carried a quieter beauty, as the sun dipped behind distant hills and fountains shimmered with the last light of day. The apprentices lingered at the edges of flower beds, observing how color shifted with fading sunlight, how the reflections on marble softened, and how shadows lengthened to meet their counterparts across gravel paths. They were learning that the king's dream was not static, but alive, evolving with light, wind, and time, demanding constant awareness and gentle care. Etienne gathered the apprentices for final adjustments before nightfall, guiding them to examine leaves, petals, and soil one last time. They learned the importance of small gestures, of noticing when a bloom was off kilter or when a trellis needed slight correction. Each correction was a meditation, a quiet conversation with nature, an act that honored both the gardener's skill and the king's vision. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, the gardens seemed to exhale, their day of perfection complete for now. Etienne led the apprentices back toward their cottages, their steps slow and deliberate, minds full of lessons in observation, balance, and harmony. They had learned that Louis XIV's dream was more than aesthetics. It was a philosophy, a way of moving through the world with intention, noticing beauty in every detail, and participating in the quiet creation of something enduring. In the calm of night, the fountains whispered. Petals released the warmth of sunlight into the cool air, and the gardens rested until the next dawn. Even in sleep, the apprentices carried lessons of symmetry, proportion, and careful observation in their hearts. They dreamed of terraces, hedges, and fountains, of light dancing on marble, and of the responsibility and privilege of shaping the world in accordance with a king's vision, learning that true perfection required patience, devotion, and reverence for the living beauty around them. The Grand Canal stretched across Versailles like a ribbon of silver, reflecting the pale morning sky and the carefully arranged trees that lined its banks. It was more than water. It was a mirror of the king's vision, a channel of reflection for both light and thought. The gardeners moved along its edges with quiet reverence, knowing that every ripple, every reflection, and every flower placed at its borders contributed to the illusion of perfection that Louis XIV demanded. Etienne paused to watch the water glisten in the early sun, noticing how the gentle current carried droplets over floating leaves and small blossoms. He explained to the apprentices that the canal was not merely decorative, but a living part of the garden's balance, a line of harmony connecting distant fountains, flower beds, and terraces. Every adjustment of a trellis or a floating lily affected the way the canal reflected light, and therefore the perception of the gardens as a whole. Children followed closely, learning to observe subtle shifts in water and light, noticing how reflections changed as the sun moved across the sky. They were taught to imagine invisible lines stretching from one side of the canal to the other, aligning statues, shrubs, and fountains in quiet dialogue with one another. The canal was a teacher of patience, showing how a slow current, a gentle breeze, and the tilt of a flower could combine to produce harmony that appeared effortless but required hours of careful labor. The king sometimes walked along the canal himself, unseen by the gardeners, inspecting its symmetry from vantage points hidden behind hedges and trees. He would note slight imperfections in alignment or proportion, and in the evening, Etienne would gather the apprentices to demonstrate subtle adjustments, teaching them to nudge floating plants, reposition trellises, or trim bordering flowers to maintain the delicate balance that Louis XIV expected. Midday brought a deeper lesson in observation and timing, for the canal responded differently depending on the position of the sun and the angle of the wind. The apprentices learned to check reflections constantly, to measure the alignment of flowers and statues with invisible lines across the water, and to understand that beauty was as much in perception as in physical form. They learned to be patient, to observe, and to anticipate how the garden would appear from every possible viewpoint, recognizing that the king's vision extended far beyond what could be seen from a single terrace. The waterkeepers moved silently, adjusting valves and clearing small channels to ensure that the canal flowed smoothly. A droplet trapped behind a stone or a fallen leaf could create a small distortion in the mirrored surface. And the gardeners learned to notice these subtleties as part of their training. Every movement of the water, every alignment of a flower, and every reflection of a tree in the canal was a meditation on harmony, proportion, and patience. Etienne took the apprentices to the far end of the canal, where the horizon stretched beyond the gardens into gentle hills and distant woodlands. He pointed out how the lines of the canal interacted with the landscape, teaching that Versailles was not an isolated creation, but part of a larger world of rolling hills, rivers, and open sky. The apprentices learned that every decision they made in the garden had consequences beyond the immediate rows of flowers, and that the canal was a guide to understanding perspective, proportion, and subtle interaction between earth and art. Evening descended slowly, and the reflections on the canal deepened, capturing the glow of the setting sun and the last blush of light on marble statues. The gardeners worked with quiet diligence, straightening hedges, adjusting trellises, and ensuring that the floating lilies remained in perfect alignment with the shadows cast by distant trees. The apprentices marveled at how a single misplaced blossom could disrupt the illusion of seamless beauty, and how careful attention restored harmony as if by gentle magic. Stories and legends flowed as softly as water that evening, whispered by elders to attentive apprentices. They spoke of past kings and gardeners who had walked these paths, of discoveries and mistakes, and of the subtle understanding that true mastery of Versailles required both skill and reverence for the land. Children learned that the Grand Canal was not merely a waterway, but a living teacher of patience, balance, and observation, offering lessons in quiet harmony that extended to every corner of life. The night settled gradually, and lanterns were lit along the canal, casting a warm glow on water and marble. Etienne gathered the apprentices for a final walk, showing them how the reflections of fountains, flowers, and statues interacted with fading light, and how every detail contributed to the perception of order and beauty. They learned to move softly, to notice subtle movements, and to respect the quiet rhythm of the canal, understanding that their hands were part of a living work of art that changed with every hour. As the apprentices returned to their cottages, the canal shimmered beneath the stars, reflecting the heavens above, as if the entire universe were mirrored in its surface. Even in the calm of sleep, they carried with them the lessons of proportion, reflection, and quiet devotion, dreaming of water, marble, and light, of delicate alignments and the subtle dialogue between human care and the living world of Versailles. In this nocturnal stillness, the apprentices understood that the Grand Canal held a secret not of magic, but of observation, patience, and harmony. They had learned that the true perfection of Versailles was measured not by grandeur alone, but by the delicate interactions between stone, water, flowers, and light, and by the gentle hands that shaped them with care and reverence. The canal whispered these truths in silence, a quiet teacher guiding them toward mastery, attentiveness, and the serene rhythm of life at Versailles. The morning air in Versailles was soft and still, carrying the delicate fragrance of roses, lavender, and freshly turned soil. The apprentices emerged from their small cottages, stretching and breathing in the calm light of dawn, their hands already tingling with the anticipation of labor and learning. The garden awaited them, a vast expanse of ordered beauty, where every hedge, flower bed, and fountain was both challenge and teacher, a living canvas demanding attention and devotion. Etienne called the group together near the orangery, his voice gentle, but filled with quiet authority. He spoke of observation first, urging the apprentices to see beyond mere appearance, to notice subtle asymmetries in flower placement, the tilt of a branch, and the way morning light refracted through dew on petals. They learned that the gardens were more than decorative. They were a dialogue with nature, a place where patience and mindfulness were cultivated as much as roses and tulips. Each apprentice was assigned a small section of the garden, a microcosm of Versailles itself. They knelt among the flowers, learning to feel the soil, to trace the growth of roots with careful hands, and to understand that every plant required a balance of attention, water, and light. They pruned slowly, following Etienne's example, listening to his instructions that seemed less like orders and more like whispered stories of plants, sun, and earth. Children learned to carry their tools lightly, as if they were extensions of their own hands rather than instruments of labor. They adjusted the paths, straightened young saplings, and ensured that fountains were unobstructed, all while maintaining silence that honored the rhythm of the garden. The work was gentle, meditative, almost musical, a choreography in which every gesture mattered and every small success was a note in the greater symphony of Versailles. Etienne led them along the hedgerows, pointing out subtle variations in light and shadow, teaching that no bloom existed in isolation and that the perception of beauty depended on context. He explained how flowers of different colors could be arranged to guide the eye along hidden lines, how the height of a hedge could create perspectives that made fountains appear larger or smaller, and how the alignment of a trellis could change the way sunlight fell across the gravel paths. The apprentices listened closely, absorbing lessons that could not be found in books, learning instead from careful attention and lived experience. By mid-morning, the sun had shifted, casting new patterns across the gardens. The apprentices observed how shadows lengthened and how reflections in the fountains altered the perception of symmetry. They learned to adjust their work accordingly, realizing that the garden was alive and responsive, a dynamic entity requiring ongoing dialogue between human care and natural forces. Etienne encouraged them to pause frequently, to notice the movement of leaves in the wind, the way water flowed over stones, and the subtle fragrance of each bloom, understanding that perfection was not imposed, but nurtured. The lessons extended to the water channels and the Grand Canal, where apprentices watched waterkeepers adjust valves and examine flow. A single fallen leaf could alter reflections, and a minor obstruction could ripple across the surface, changing the way sunlight struck nearby flowers and marble. They learned to move quietly, with patience, understanding that even the smallest disturbance could affect the harmony of the garden. Observation, care, and respect became their guiding principles, a rhythm that would shape both their hands and their hearts. Etienne spoke often of the unseen work, of flowers and trees that were transplanted and nurtured before anyone would notice them, of soil tilled for months and fountains aligned over days to catch light in just the right way. He reminded the apprentices that true mastery required attention to what was subtle, delicate, and often hidden, and that only through careful repetition and mindfulness could the gardens reflect the King's vision. Without revealing the labor behind it, afternoon brought lessons in collaboration and communication. The apprentices worked in pairs, learning to adjust hedges together, align flower beds in harmony, and anticipate each other's movements. They discovered that patience extended beyond the garden itself, encompassing human relationships, shared observation, and a collective responsibility to maintain the living art they were entrusted with. Through gentle guidance and quiet conversation, they learned to balance initiative with restraint, creativity with discipline, and observation with action. The gardens provided moments of reflection as well as instruction. Etienne encouraged the apprentices to sit beneath arching trellises, feeling the sun on their shoulders, listening to the hum of bees, and observing the gentle ripple of water in the fountains. They wrote notes in memory rather than ink, tracing patterns with their fingers in the soil, learning that the lessons of Versailles were absorbed not only through sight, but through touch, smell, and quiet contemplation. Evening descended slowly, wrapping the gardens in golden light that softened the edges of marble and foliage. The apprentices moved along pathways, checking flower beds, adjusting trellises, and ensuring that every hedge and bloom remained aligned with the vision of the day. The work was deliberate, unhurried, a meditation in motion, teaching them that the rhythm of labor itself was a form of learning, a way to attune the mind to beauty, precision, and harmony. As the sun dipped behind distant hills, Etienne gathered the apprentices near the central fountain. He spoke of the gardens as teachers of life itself, illustrating how observation, patience, and care applied not only to plants, but to thought, action, and understanding. They learned that every day in Versailles was a lesson, that mastery was gradual, and that beauty required both discipline and gentleness. The blending of human intention with natural flow. Night fell softly, and lanterns were lit along pathways, casting gentle glows on the flowers, fountains, and marble statues. The apprentices returned to their cottages, their minds filled with the day's lessons, and their hearts attuned to the rhythm of the garden. They dreamt of alignment, proportion, and the subtle interplay of light, water, and stone, carrying the silent teachings of Versailles into their sleep and into the days that would follow. In the quiet of night, the gardens whispered their secrets, teaching that the king's perfection was sustained not by grandeur alone, but by countless patient hands, attentive eyes, and thoughtful hearts. The apprentices understood that they were part of a living, breathing creation, one that demanded reverence, care, and mindfulness, and that the true lesson of Versailles was in the harmony between human devotion and the gentle rhythms of the natural world. The morning sun rose slowly over Versailles, spilling pale gold across the terraces and fountains. The gardens seemed to hold their breath in anticipation, aware that today was unlike any other day. The festival was approaching, a celebration of light, music, and elegance, and the preparations demanded precision, patience, and careful attention from every gardener, waterkeeper, and apprentice in the estate. Etienne gathered the apprentices near the orangery, his voice calm yet firm. He spoke of the festival not merely as a display for the king and his court, but as an opportunity to showcase the quiet mastery and devotion that maintained the garden's living perfection. They would work on arrangements of flowers, align fountains to capture sunlight in particular angles, and ensure that every pathway, trellis, and hedge reflected harmony and elegance, a reflection of the king's grandeur. Apprentices moved through the gardens like gentle shadows, placing blooms with deliberate care, trimming hedges along invisible lines, and adjusting fountains to mirror sunlight as it shifted across the morning sky. They learned that the festival demanded more than simple arrangement. It required a subtle orchestration of elements, a choreography in which water, stone, and flora danced together to create scenes of serenity and wonder. Each step was measured, each gesture quiet yet purposeful, a meditation in action. The central flower beds were transformed with seasonal blooms, carefully selected for color, fragrance, and height. Etienne demonstrated how grouping flowers of complementary hues could guide the eye along a pathway, how subtle differences in height could enhance perspective, and how gentle curves in the hedges led visitors naturally toward the fountains and statues. The apprentices traced invisible lines, imagining the gaze of the king and his guests as they moved through the gardens, ensuring that each arrangement contributed to the overall sense of harmony. Waterkeepers prepared the fountains with extraordinary care, checking valves, cleaning channels, and adjusting the flow to produce reflections that would catch the early light perfectly. The Grand Canal shimmered in the morning sun, a mirror for the sky and the surrounding gardens, its surface undisturbed by ripple or shadow. The apprentices learned that water was as much a medium of expression as flowers or marble, that every droplet contributed to the visual symphony of Versailles, and that patience and subtle attention were required to maintain it. Throughout the day, soft chatter and whispered instructions filled the gardens. Etienne guided the apprentices in refining details, demonstrating how even a slight tilt of a flower or a minor shift of a trellis could transform perception of symmetry and beauty. They moved slowly, deliberately, aligning petals with shadows, hedges with sunlight, and fountains with distant statues, each adjustment a meditation, a quiet conversation with the living artistry of the estate. Afternoon light created new patterns across the gardens, and the apprentices learned to observe these changes, adjusting flower placements, pruning leaves, and refining pathways to preserve harmony under shifting conditions. The festival was as much a lesson in observation and adaptability as it was in decoration. The gardens themselves seemed to instruct, whispering insights about proportion, balance, and the interplay of natural light with human intention. The apprentices discovered that the festival's preparation was also a test of endurance and patience. Every path they walked, every flower they adjusted, and every fountain they aligned demanded careful repetition, for the slightest oversight could diminish the illusion of effortless perfection that the king expected. Etienne reminded them that attention to subtle detail, even unseen by most, was what elevated their work from simple gardening to art, and that the joy of mastery lay in quiet diligence rather than applause. As evening approached, lanterns were installed along walkways, casting a warm glow over hedges, fountains, and flower beds. The apprentices observed the interplay of artificial light with natural shadows, adjusting elements to maintain the illusion of continuous beauty. The reflections on the Grand Canal deepened, mirroring lantern light and distant marble, and the gardens transformed into a living tapestry of color, shadow, and light, ready to welcome the king and his court. Etienne led a final inspection, moving through every section of the gardens with calm scrutiny. He whispered lessons about perspective, guiding apprentices to see the gardens not only as observers, but as participants in a dialogue between nature and human care. They learned that beauty was cultivated in layers, that each adjustment had a ripple effect, and that their attention and devotion were essential to sustaining the harmony that the king cherished. Night settled over Versailles, and the gardens seemed to exhale, their day of preparation complete for now. The apprentices, weary yet fulfilled, returned to their cottages with hearts attuned to the quiet rhythm of the gardens. They carried lessons in proportion, observation, patience, and subtlety, and even in sleep they dreamed of flower beds, fountains, and lantern-lit paths, imagining the gardens alive with the music, movement, and light of the festival to come. In the stillness of night, the gardens whispered their secrets to attentive ears, teaching that true perfection was not only in grand displays, but in countless quiet acts of care, precision, and mindfulness. Etienne reminded the apprentices that their work was part of a living legacy, that every hedge, every bloom, and every ripple in the canal contributed to the enduring beauty of Versailles, and that in patience, observation, and gentle devotion, they had discovered the heart of the king's dream. The morning mist lingered over the gardens of Versailles as the apprentices gathered near the rows of marble statues. Etienne's voice broke the silence, gentle but deliberate, urging them to observe the curves, shadows, and the subtle play of light across the sculpted figures. Each statue, he explained, was more than stone. It was a story, a whisper of time captured in marble, a frozen moment of devotion, skill, and imagination that demanded patience and reverence. Apprentices walked slowly along the pathways, their eyes tracing the lines of shoulders, the tilt of heads, and the graceful folds of robes carved with meticulous care. They learned that every statue had its purpose, whether it was to guide the eye along a garden path, to frame a fountain, or to catch sunlight at particular hours of the day. Etienne encouraged them to look closely, to notice the minute imperfections, the small chisel marks that revealed the artist's hand, and the careful balance between form and function. The king believed that statues were more than decoration. They were symbols of order, control, and refinement. They reflected human achievement, divine inspiration, and the harmony of art with the natural world. Etienne showed the apprentices how each sculpture interacted with its surroundings, casting shadows on carefully aligned flower beds, complementing the geometry of gravel paths, and catching reflections in fountains. Through observation, the apprentices discovered that art was alive in its context, that marble was not static, but engaged in dialogue with light, space, and the attentiveness of viewers. Hands brushed over cool stone, feeling the smoothness of polished marble, and the subtle indentations that revealed a sculptor's touch. The apprentices learned patience in these moments, recognizing that every curve, every angle, and every detail required countless hours of deliberate care. They understood that the statues were silent teachers, revealing lessons about proportion, balance, and the merging of human intention with natural perception. Midday brought sunlight that danced across the sculptures, highlighting details invisible in the softer morning light. The apprentices observed the way shadows lengthened and shortened, how light reflected in the eyes of carved figures, and how the positioning of each statue affected the perception of surrounding gardens. Etienne spoke of alignment, symmetry, and the importance of subtlety, teaching them that even the most magnificent creation could be diminished by careless placement or thoughtless neglect. Children moved along the paths with quiet reverence, arranging flowers at the feet of statues and adjusting small decorative elements that enhanced the interaction of light and form. They were learning to see the gardens as an interconnected canvas, where every gesture, whether of stone, flower, or water, contributed to the overall impression of harmony. The apprentices realized that Versailles was a living gallery, a space where art and nature coexisted in delicate balance, requiring observation, devotion, and a gentle hand. Etienne often paused beside the statues to tell stories of their origins, of sculptors who had labored in quiet workshops, chiseling away at marble for months or years to achieve perfection. He spoke of unseen assistants who polished surfaces, of designs that were refined and revised, and of subtle innovations in form that made each figure unique yet harmonious with its surroundings. The apprentices listened closely, absorbing lessons in artistry, patience, and the meticulous attention to detail that shaped not only marble, but perception itself. Afternoon shadows shifted across the gardens, and the apprentices adjusted minor elements, realigning hedges, repositioning small potted plants, and ensuring that each statue remained in harmony with the evolving light. They learned that beauty was dynamic, that context mattered as much as form, and that even the slightest misalignment could disturb the dialogue between marble, garden, and observer. Etienne encouraged them to observe carefully, to move with intention, and to cultivate patience in every gesture. As the day waned, the sun cast a golden glow that made the marble seem almost alive, warming the stone and illuminating its delicate details. The apprentices stood quietly, marveling at how the statues interacted with light, shadow, and surrounding flora, creating subtle stories that unfolded slowly throughout the day. They realized that perfection was not instantaneous, but a product of repeated care, attentive observation, and thoughtful placement. Evening brought a hush to the gardens, and lanterns were lit to highlight the most striking sculptures. The apprentices walked slowly among the illuminated figures, observing reflections in nearby fountains, shadows that stretched across gravel paths, and the soft glow of lantern light on marble. The statues seemed to whisper their secrets, teaching lessons in proportion, perspective, and the delicate balance between human intention and natural beauty. At night, the apprentices returned to their cottages, their minds filled with the quiet grandeur of the statues and the gardens they inhabited. Even in sleep, they carried lessons in observation, patience, and harmony, dreaming of light glancing across marble, of shadows moving gently over flower beds, and of the subtle interplay between art and landscape that defined Versailles. In the stillness of night, Etienne reminded them that the statues were not only objects of admiration, but living lessons in dedication, precision, and reverence. They had learned that every curve, shadow, and reflection was meaningful, and that the true perfection of Versailles relied not only on the grandeur of the king, but on countless quiet acts of care, observation, and devotion, whispered by marble and soil alike into the hearts of those who tended them. The orangery at Versailles stood as a quiet sanctuary, a long hall of glass and stone where sunlight poured in, illuminating rows of citrus trees, potted plants, and carefully arranged vines. The air was warm, scented faintly with orange blossoms and damp earth, carrying the subtle hum of life within its walls. Etienne led the apprentices inside, their footsteps soft against the tiled floor, echoing gently in the spacious, serene environment. apprentices paused to observe the trees, noting the delicate curvature of branches and the careful arrangement of leaves and fruit. Etienne explained that the orangery was not merely functional, a shelter for exotic plants, but a space of learning, observation, and quiet experimentation. They would study how light affected growth, how temperature shifted across the long hall, and how subtle differences in soil and water could alter the shape and color of each tree. The day began with careful inspection, apprentices moving slowly along the rows, checking leaves for imperfections, gently brushing dust from branches, and noting the placement of each plant. Etienne emphasized patience, teaching that the true lesson of the orangery lay not in haste, but in careful, consistent observation. They learned to see patterns in growth, to anticipate the needs of each tree, and to understand how the environment influenced every curve of branch and every burst of blossom. Mid-morning brought a quiet discussion about the nature of care. Etienne spoke softly about how gardeners were both observers and participants, that tending plants was a dialogue rather than a command. He described how each citrus tree responded differently to sunlight, soil, and pruning, and how the gardener's hands needed to be guided by attention and intuition rather than force. Children listened attentively, practicing gentle movements, trimming leaves, adjusting supports, and feeling the pulse of life within each plant. The orangery became a place of reflection as well as work, where apprentices could observe the effects of the changing sky through large glass panes, noting how shadows and light shifted across the floor and foliage. They learned that patience was as essential as technique, and that understanding subtle signals from plants was a form of quiet meditation. The room itself seemed to encourage contemplation. Each tree, vine, and flower a teacher in rhythm, balance, and harmony. By midday, a soft breeze moved through open windows, carrying the scent of the gardens outside and stirring leaves in gentle currents. Apprentices observed how movement of air affected blossoms and branches, learning to anticipate subtle changes in temperature, humidity, and light. They learned that nature was never static, that every element of the orangery interacted with another, and that mastery required not domination, but attentive cooperation with the living environment. Etienne guided them to experiment gently, adjusting supports, watering in measured amounts, and observing responses over hours. The apprentices noted how branches leaned toward light, how buds opened in time with the sun, and how small adjustments could enhance symmetry, balance, and vitality. They were learning that perfection was cultivated slowly, with patience, understanding, and reverence, and that the orangery provided a controlled stage for these lessons in subtlety and care. Afternoon brought reflection on the history of the orangery itself, how it had housed exotic plants brought from distant lands, a testament to the king's desire for beauty, curiosity, and knowledge. Etienne spoke of the gardeners who had tended it long before them, of careful records, subtle experiments, and innovations that had allowed the delicate plants to thrive despite the harsh winters of France. The apprentices absorbed these stories like whispers of the past, feeling connected to generations of caretakers who had shaped the orangery with devotion and skill. As sunlight waned, apprentices adjusted shadows and light by gently moving pots and trimming foliage, ensuring that each row of citrus, each vine, and each flower was positioned harmoniously. They practiced subtle interventions, learning that even small acts of care could ripple outward, affecting perception, growth, and the overall harmony of the orangery. The air was filled with quiet diligence, soft breathing, and occasional whispers of guidance from Etienne, creating a rhythm of work and learning that felt almost musical. Evening descended slowly, casting a golden glow through the glass panels and highlighting the delicate textures of leaves and bark. The apprentices paused, observing how the last rays of sunlight played across the floor, creating patterns that echoed the careful alignment of trees and pots. They learned that light, shadow, and placement were inseparable from care, that observation and action were intertwined, and that every gentle adjustment contributed to the living artistry of Versailles. Night settled over the orangery, and lanterns were lit along the tiled paths, their soft glow enhancing reflections in polished pots and the subtle sheen of leaves. Apprentices walked slowly, noting the interplay of artificial and fading natural light, understanding that beauty depended as much on timing and awareness as on skill and effort. They absorbed the quiet lessons whispered by the trees, vines, and blooms, learning patience, attentiveness, and the silent dialogue between human care and living nature. Before leaving, Etienne gathered the apprentices for a final reflection, speaking softly of respect, reverence, and the patience required to tend life over time. He reminded them that the orangery was both a teacher and a sanctuary, that mastery came from observation, gentle intervention, and quiet devotion, and that the true lessons of Versailles extended far beyond hedges and fountains into the understanding of balance, rhythm, and subtle interaction with the living world. As they returned to their cottages, the orangery remained bathed in a soft nocturnal glow, a haven of quiet learning and observation. The apprentices carried with them not only knowledge of horticulture, but a sense of meditation, rhythm, and harmony, dreaming of sunlight, shadow, and the gentle sway of branches in the still, fragrant air. They understood that the whispers of the orangery were eternal, offering guidance in patience, care, and devotion, gently shaping both hands and hearts into the rhythm of Versailles. As the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, the apprentices made their way toward the Petit Trianon, the smaller palace nestled quietly within the gardens of Versailles. The golden light brushed the stone walls, casting long shadows across the lawns and softly illuminating paths lined with carefully clipped hedges. There was a hush over the grounds, a gentle pause between the rhythm of day and the calm of evening, inviting reflection and quiet thought. Etienne led the apprentices along the winding paths, his steps deliberate and measured. He spoke softly of perspective, of how distance and light could change the way one perceived gardens, architecture, and human labor. Each apprentice carried a small notebook, recording observations, thoughts, and gentle insights, learning that understanding was as much about reflection as it was about action. The Trianon, he explained, was not only a retreat for the king, but a space where patience, observation, and subtlety could be cultivated. Inside the Petit Trianon, sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching in polished floors, gilded frames, and delicate furniture. The apprentices moved slowly, careful to make no sudden noise, observing the subtle play of light on tapestries, the reflection of gardens in mirrors, and the gentle hum of wind against the glass. Etienne reminded them that interiors, like gardens, demanded attention to detail, that each shadow, angle, and line contributed to the impression of harmony and serenity. They paused in a small sitting room overlooking the Grand Canal, the water catching the last rays of the day. Etienne spoke of the quiet work of servants and gardeners alike, how countless small acts of care maintained beauty and order. The apprentices listened attentively, learning that mastery was often hidden, revealed only to those who observed with patience, humility, and respect. They noted the reflections of trees in water, the curve of distant pathways, and the interplay of sunlight and shadow across the canal, understanding that perception depended on both mindfulness and attention. As evening deepened, Etienne encouraged the apprentices to write gentle reflections, to sketch impressions of gardens, statues, and interiors. Hands moved slowly across paper, translating observations into delicate lines, soft shading, and subtle notes. The act of recording thoughts became itself a lesson in patience and mindfulness. The apprentices realized that observation, like gardening or tending fountains, was a craft to be honed with care, repetition, and quiet devotion. The Trianon gardens outside were suffused with the amber light of sunset. Apprentices stepped onto the terraces, feeling the cool breeze against their skin and the faint scent of jasmine, roses, and citrus blossoms. Etienne guided them to pause and listen. The distant rustle of leaves, the gentle trickle of fountains, the hum of insects settling for night. They learned that these subtle sounds were part of the harmony of Versailles, that awareness of quiet rhythms informed every choice in tending the gardens or arranging flowers and statues. They moved along paths lined with hedges trimmed to perfection, pausing at flower beds to observe the delicate positioning of blooms, noticing how shadows lengthened and shifted across petals and soil. Etienne spoke softly about timing, how the same garden could appear entirely different depending on hour, season, or light. Apprentices understood that patience extended beyond daily labor. It encompassed observation, reflection, and the ability to notice subtle changes that unfolded over hours, days, or even years. As night approached, lanterns were lit along paths and terraces, casting a warm golden glow across the Trianon and its gardens. The apprentices walked slowly, feeling the soft light on their hands and faces, noticing reflections on marble, glass, and water. Etienne encouraged them to move deliberately, observing the interplay of light, shadow, and perspective. They learned that beauty was not only in grand displays but in subtle alignments, gentle touches, and the quiet harmony of all elements in balance. Sitting by the edge of a small fountain, the apprentices reflected on the day. Etienne reminded them that the Trianon was both a place of leisure and a classroom of observation, teaching the patience to notice, the humility to accept imperfections, and the devotion to refine gently, quietly, and persistently. Apprentices felt the weight of history in the stones, terraces, and flowing water, learning that human care and time were intertwined in the creation and preservation of beauty. Before retiring for the night, they walked one last time through shadowed corridors and garden paths, absorbing the rhythm of the fading day. The Petit Trianon whispered its lessons of proportion, observation, and serenity. In the stillness, the apprentices understood that mastery was cultivated slowly, that every subtle adjustment, quiet observation, and gentle act of care contributed to a living tapestry of elegance and harmony. Night settled softly over the Trianon, lanterns glowing faintly, the gentle murmur of fountains, and distant trees swaying in the breeze. The apprentices returned to their quarters, hearts attuned to the quiet rhythm of Versailles, minds carrying the gentle whispers of reflection, observation, and patience. In dreams, they wandered gardens and terraces, lantern-lit paths, and flowered corridors, understanding that the true lessons of Versailles were as much about mindfulness, harmony, and gentle devotion as they were about grandeur, statues, or fountains. The moon rose slowly over the gardens of Versailles, casting silver light across the Grand Canal. The water shimmered faintly, reflecting the marble terraces, statues, and carefully clipped hedges with a delicate brilliance. A soft breeze whispered through the trees, rustling leaves and carrying the faint scent of jasmine and roses. In this quiet hour, the gardens seemed suspended between worlds, neither fully awake nor entirely at rest, holding their breath as though in reverence for the night. Etienne led the apprentices along the stone pathways bordering the canal, their footsteps softened by the thick carpet of grass and the subtle sound of water lapping against the banks. He spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper, reminding them that midnight was a time for observation, reflection, and quiet attention. The apprentices walked slowly, taking in the interplay of moonlight on water, the shadows of trees stretching across paths, and the gentle gleam of marble sculptures in the dim light. They paused beside a marble statue of Apollo, its features softened by moonlight, the curves of his body and the tilt of his head revealing the sculptor's meticulous attention to detail. Etienne encouraged the apprentices to study the statue, not only for its artistry but for how it interacted with the night. Shadows lengthened, reflections shifted, and even the stillness of stone seemed alive when touched by the pale light. The apprentices realized that beauty and perception were dynamic, that every moment held subtle variations that could teach patience and mindfulness. Moving further along the canal, the apprentices observed the water's surface, calm yet subtly moving with wind and current. Etienne spoke of reflection, not just of light on water, but of thought and observation. He encouraged the apprentices to consider how the gardens reflected human care, devotion, and patience. Every hedge, flower, and fountain was a mirror of meticulous effort, and the apprentices learned that quiet reflection was as vital to mastery as careful labor. Midnight brought a stillness that heightened awareness. Frogs croaked softly, insects hummed faintly, and the distant rustle of leaves became a gentle rhythm. apprentices knelt beside the water, tracing the ripple patterns with their fingers, noticing how the reflection of the moon moved with each subtle disturbance. Etienne reminded them that the smallest gestures mattered, that tending the gardens like life itself required attentiveness, patience, and respect for delicate balance. The apprentices paused at the foot of the Grand Canal, where the water widened to mirror the sky. They watched the moon's reflection elongate across the surface, merging with the silhouettes of distant trees and hedges. Etienne spoke softly of alignment, perspective, and the passage of time, teaching them that the gardens were not merely arranged for beauty, but for understanding. The interplay between human intention and natural rhythm. Every observation, he explained, was a lesson in harmony, proportion, and the quiet patience of creation. As they moved along, lanterns flickered faintly from nearby pathways, casting gentle shadows that danced across the canal's surface. Apprentices learned to notice subtle changes, the slight movement of reeds, the ripple of water against stone, the way marble reflected soft light. They understood that mastery lay not in grand gestures, but in these quiet observations, the ability to perceive small details, and the patience to align their care with the rhythms of nature. Etienne guided them to pause frequently, to kneel or sit beside the water, observing reflections, shadows, and textures. Apprentices realized that midnight was a teacher of stillness, offering lessons in perception, attentiveness, and the subtle dialogue between light, stone, water, and living greenery. They felt a sense of calm deepening with each moment, a quiet immersion in the pulse of Versailles, where every leaf, ripple, and marble curve had its role to play in the greater harmony. The apprentices traced paths along the canal, stopping to adjust small details, tidying fallen petals, straightening a vase, or gently trimming leaves along the edge of a flower bed. Each act was deliberate, measured, and infused with the understanding that small interventions, performed with care, contributed to the lasting elegance and serenity of the gardens. Etienne reminded them that patience, observation, and respect were the true foundations of their work, as much as skill or strength. Before returning to their cottages, the apprentices stood silently at the water's edge, reflecting on the night, the gardens, and the quiet symphony of light and shadow around them. Etienne spoke softly of legacy, teaching that every subtle act of care, every gentle adjustment, and every moment of attentive observation contributed to a living history, one that would endure in stone, water, and plant for generations to come. The apprentices left the canal under a sky full of stars, hearts quiet, minds attuned to the gentle rhythm of Versailles. Even in sleep, they carried the soft whispers of midnight, the reflection of moon on water, the shadow of trees along paths, and the enduring dialogue between human care and the living garden. In dreams, they wandered through lantern-lit terraces, marble-lined walkways, and the serene waters of the Grand Canal, learning that patience, attention, and quiet devotion were the truest keys to understanding the heart of Versailles. The fountains of Versailles whispered their presence long before the apprentices reached them. Even in the soft light of early morning, the gentle murmur of water carried across gravel paths, mingling with birdsong and the subtle rustle of leaves. Etienne led the group along winding avenues, his footsteps quiet, his voice soft, reminding them to listen first, observe next, and touch only with respect. Each fountain, he explained, was not simply a display of wealth or grandeur, but a lesson in precision, artistry, and harmony. Apprentices approached the first fountain, a grand basin of marble adorned with carved figures of nymphs and cherubs. Water flowed steadily from carefully hidden pipes, cascading over sculpted rocks and pooling below in gentle ripples. Etienne encouraged the children to notice every detail, the subtle angle of a spout, the rhythm of falling water, the way sunlight caught droplets mid-air and scattered tiny rainbows across the stone. Apprentices traced the water with their eyes, following its path from source to basin, feeling the soft vibrations through the marble beneath their fingertips. The fountains taught lessons in patience. No spout could be misaligned, no pipe bent carelessly. Etienne explained how careful adjustments created not only perfect arcs and cascades, but harmonious sound, gentle enough to lull the gardens into calm, yet lively enough to bring the senses to alert attention. Apprentices learned to listen for irregularities, a faint gurgle signaling a blocked channel, a ripple that hinted at imbalance, a sound out of rhythm with surrounding fountains. Every sound, movement, and reflection was part of the language of water. Mid-morning sunlight danced on the surface, drawing shimmering patterns across basins, sculptures, and the surrounding stonework. Etienne guided the apprentices to experiment with small interventions, adjusting valves, clearing leaves, and observing how subtle changes affected flow and alignment. They discovered that fountains were living art, responding to care, weather, and time. Patience and observation were key, for each minor action rippled outward, affecting not only a single jet, but the entire symphony of water, stone, and surrounding gardens. The apprentices moved from fountain to fountain, each with its own personality and lessons. Some were serene and still, reflecting the sky with perfect clarity. Others were dynamic, sending arcs of water high into the air, sparkling in the sunlight. Etienne explained that each required different attentiveness. Some demanded subtle adjustments, others careful calibration. The apprentices learned that mastery was not uniform. It was contextual, adaptive, and deeply connected to observation and timing. Children knelt beside shallow basins, tracing the path of droplets, and noting how reflections shifted as sunlight moved across the gardens. They learned to anticipate changes in flow, to understand the interaction between wind and water, and to predict how shadows lengthened and shortened across the stone. Etienne spoke of symmetry and rhythm, emphasizing that fountains were more than decoration. They were the pulse of the gardens, echoing human care in concert with natural elements. By midday, the fountains gleamed under the sun, casting patterns of moving light across marble statues and flower beds. Apprentices worked quietly, moving small stones, adjusting plants nearby to ensure reflections were unbroken, and observing the interplay of light, water, and shadow. Etienne reminded them that every ripple, reflection, and sound contributed to a living harmony, teaching mindfulness, patience, and the art of subtle intervention. Even the smallest gestures, he said, shaped perception, experience, and the delicate equilibrium of Versailles. Afternoon brought gentle experiments. Apprentices adjusted nozzles, observing how arcs of water altered with the slightest change in pressure or angle. They noticed how reflections danced differently on curved marble versus flat basins, how sunlight and clouds transformed the visual rhythm of water, and how a single droplet's path could be a miniature lesson in gravity, balance, and beauty. Etienne encouraged them to treat each fountain as a living teacher, requiring attention, empathy, and deliberate care. As shadows lengthened, the apprentices paused to reflect on the fountain's symphony, the sound of water, the shimmer of light, and the delicate patterns of movement. Etienne spoke softly of legacy, reminding them that generations of gardeners had tended these fountains, that human attention, precision, and care were woven into every jet, basin, and sculpture. Apprentices felt a quiet connection to those who came before, understanding that their labor was part of an enduring tradition, one measured in patience, observation, and subtle mastery rather than grandeur alone. Evening descended over the gardens, lanterns casting gentle light along paths and terraces. The fountains murmured softly, their reflections shifting across marble and water as apprentices made final adjustments for the day. Etienne encouraged them to pause, to listen, and to notice the gentle hum, the ripple, the shimmer, and to remember that true care meant quiet observation, precise action, and respect for the living balance of nature, stone, and water. Before returning to their quarters, the apprentices stood silently by the grandest fountain, watching the final rays of sunlight glint across water and marble. They felt the soft vibration under their fingers, heard the gentle murmur echo along the gardens, and understood that Versailles was alive in subtle ways, in quiet rhythms, in patient care. Nightfall wrapped the gardens in stillness, But the apprentices carried the lessons of fountains, observation, patience, reverence, and harmony deep into their dreams, where arcs of water glimmered, jets danced in gentle rhythm, and the symphony of Versailles continued in quiet eternity. As the sun sank low behind the western terraces of Versailles, the apprentices wandered along the winding avenues of hedges, their shadows stretching long across gravel paths and carefully clipped edges. The warm amber of twilight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light upon sculpted bushes and statues that seemed to glow softly in the fading sun. Etienne walked beside them, his voice low and deliberate, teaching that every hedge, every path, and every line of foliage was part of a living geometry, a dialogue between human care and natural growth. The apprentices paused frequently, observing the subtle interplay of shadow and light across the maze-like hedges. Etienne encouraged them to notice the curve of each path, the way the tops of the hedges caught the final rays of sunlight, and the delicate angles where trimmed leaves met branches. They learned that hedges were not merely walls of greenery, but living sculptures, shaped by hands, light, and time, each with its own rhythm, balance, and expression. Along the main avenues, the apprentices traced paths flanked by yew and boxwood, noticing how carefully aligned corners framed distant fountains, statues, and glimpses of the sky. Etienne explained that perspective was an art, that gardeners and architects alike had collaborated to ensure every hedge guided the eye gently, directing attention to beauty while maintaining harmony. Apprentices realized that walking among hedges was itself a form of observation, teaching patience, awareness, and appreciation for subtlety. Twilight deepened, and the air carried the faint scent of roses, jasmine, and moist earth. Apprentices walked softly, feeling the texture of gravel beneath their feet, hearing the distant murmur of fountains, and observing how shadows lengthened, shifted, and intertwined with the forms of hedges and trees. Etienne reminded them that beauty in Versailles was never accidental. It was the result of countless hours of care, adjustment, and thoughtful observation, requiring patience as much as skill. They paused beside a low hedge, shaped into the form of a winding serpent, its curves echoing through the avenue. Apprentices ran fingers lightly along trimmed leaves, noticing how subtle variations created rhythm and balance. Etienne spoke of imperfection, teaching that nature was never entirely uniform, and that the gardener's role was to guide, harmonize, and enhance, not to dominate. The apprentices felt the pulse of life in each leaf, understanding that attention, patience, and subtle intervention were the hallmarks of true mastery. Along hidden side paths, the apprentices encountered flower beds bordered by sculpted hedges. Etienne guided them to observe how blooms complemented trimmed greenery, how colors and textures flowed from one bed to another, and how the arrangement invited quiet contemplation. Each path offered a new lesson in proportion, balance, and harmony. The apprentices realized that walking through Versailles was not merely movement, but immersion in deliberate beauty, where every step revealed thoughtful intention, rhythm, and care. As evening deepened, lanterns were lit along paths, casting soft pools of golden light that danced on leaves and gravel, and apprentices moved slowly, noticing the contrast between the fading natural light and the lantern glow, how shadows shifted across hedges, statues, and distant terraces. Etienne reminded them that perception changed with light, and that the gardener's work was never static. It responded to the movement of sun, moon, and stars. Apprentices learned to attune their senses, understanding subtle shifts in color, shadow, and texture, and how awareness of these shifts informed every act of care. Midway through the twilight walk, they paused at a central intersection where hedges formed a delicate pattern around a small fountain. Apprentices knelt, observing symmetry, proportion, and how small deviations could alter perception. Etienne encouraged gentle corrections, adjustments that honored the natural forms while enhancing balance. The apprentices discovered that even minor interventions, executed with attention and patience, could transform the visual rhythm of a space, harmonizing human intention with living nature. Toward the western terraces, the apprentices observed distant avenues fading into shadow. Etienne spoke softly of continuity, explaining that every hedge, fountain, and tree connected to another in a subtle conversation of lines, shapes, and perspectives. The apprentices felt the garden stretching endlessly, a living tapestry shaped by hands, eyes, and hearts across generations. Twilight taught them that patience, observation, and careful adjustment were essential not only for beauty, but for understanding the quiet, persistent language of the gardens. By the time night settled fully over the hedges, the apprentices had absorbed the lessons of shadow, light, rhythm, and proportion. Lanterns glimmered softly, leaves whispered in the breeze, and statues seemed to breathe in the gentle stillness. Etienne gathered the apprentices for a final reflection, reminding them that mastery in the gardens, like in life, required mindfulness, patience, and reverence. Every hedge was a teacher, every path a lesson, and every gentle adjustment a dialogue with time, nature, and human care. As they returned to their cottages, the apprentices carried with them the rhythm of the twilight walk, the quiet knowledge of lines and curves, light and shadow, and the gentle understanding that the beauty of Versailles was an ongoing conversation between living gardens and attentive hands. Dreams that night were filled with winding hedges, lantern-lit paths, and soft whispers of leaves, instilling patience, reflection, and the serene cadence of observation in young hearts attuned to the rhythm of the gardens. The moon hung low over Versailles, its silver glow spilling across the carefully tended rose gardens. Petals glimmered with dew, shimmering softly as if sprinkled with tiny fragments of starlight. The scent of roses, jasmine, and lilies mingled in the cool night air, a delicate perfume that guided the apprentices along winding gravel paths. Etienne led them with slow, deliberate steps, reminding them that moonlight offered a different perspective, a quiet illumination that revealed textures, shadows, and forms unseen by the midday sun. Apprentices moved softly among the beds, noticing how the silver light touched each bloom differently. Etienne spoke of contrast and subtlety, teaching that roses were not only beautiful in color but in shape, arrangement, and response to light. Each curve of a petal, every tilt of a stem, reflected careful cultivation and attention. Moonlight revealed hidden rhythms, a shadow stretching across leaves, a cluster of blossoms leaning toward the silver glow, a subtle undulation in the garden's surface. Observing these patterns was a lesson in patience, perception, and the quiet dialogue between human care and natural growth. They paused beside a small fountain nestled in the heart of the rose gardens. Etienne encouraged apprentices to notice reflections of moonlight on water, the interplay between ripples and petals, and the delicate balance of scent, sound, and visual harmony. The apprentices knelt to trace arcs of water with their fingers, feeling vibrations and observing how droplets scattered across marble. Each fountain, like each rosebed, was a teacher of mindfulness, demonstrating the consequences of care, attention, and deliberate action. The apprentices moved along curving avenues of roses, their lanterns casting pools of soft light that mingled with the moon's glow. Etienne explained that nocturnal observation trained the eye differently than daylight. Shadows became teachers, shapes and textures revealed hidden beauty, and the subtle interplay of fragrance guided the senses. Apprentices learned to move slowly, breathe deeply, and absorb the quiet rhythm of the garden, understanding that mastery required attunement to the living environment and the patience to notice what was easily overlooked. At a small alcove surrounded by climbing roses, Etienne paused to show how trellises and arches framed the sky and distant terraces. Apprentices saw that light, shadow, and perspective transformed the same garden depending on hour and weather. Moonlight painted textures differently than sunlight, revealing details in leaves, petals, and stonework that might otherwise go unnoticed. They discovered that night offered a contemplative rhythm, a pace in which observation deepened and attention sharpened without haste. Along hidden corners, apprentices noticed delicate clusters of roses, petals kissed with dew, leaning toward the moonlight as though in silent greeting. Etienne spoke softly of alignment and proportion, demonstrating how each plant, trellis, and stone influenced perception. Apprentices learned to adjust stakes, gently prune leaves, and align blooms in ways that honored natural growth while enhancing harmony. Every action was deliberate, measured, and infused with respect for the subtle lessons of light, shadow, and scent. The winding paths revealed small surprises, tiny fountains hidden among foliage, statues of nymphs partially obscured by climbing roses, and gravel paths glistening under moonlight. Etienne encouraged apprentices to observe, reflect, and record, noting how subtle changes in angle, spacing, or pruning influenced overall perception. Moonlit walks became an exercise in mindfulness, cultivating patience, attention, and an appreciation for ephemeral beauty. Apprentices began to notice that the quiet of night magnified the connection between gardener and garden, teaching care, empathy, and rhythm. As they continued, the apprentices paused frequently, inhaling the sweet fragrance of roses, feeling dew cool against fingers, and listening to the gentle trickle of water from hidden fountains. Etienne reminded them that patience extended beyond physical labor. It encompassed observation, contemplation, and the ability to understand subtle changes over time. The gardens, he explained, were alive in sound, scent, and reflection, each bloom and leaf a note in a symphony of harmony. Toward the far edge of the rose gardens, the apprentices reached a small terrace overlooking the Grand Canal. Moonlight reflected off water, casting elongated silver patterns that mingled with shadows of hedges and rose arches. Etienne spoke of continuity and connection, explaining that every bed, fountain, and path was part of a larger tapestry. Apprentices felt the garden's rhythm as a living pulse, a quiet harmony shaped by attentive hands across decades and centuries. Before returning to their quarters, the apprentices walked one last time along the moonlit avenues, pausing to observe reflections, shadows, and petals in soft silver light. Each rose, fountain, and trellis offered subtle lessons in observation, alignment, and respect. Etienne reminded them that beauty required care, that true understanding arose from attention and mindfulness, and that moonlight revealed nuances often hidden by day. Apprentices carried these quiet revelations with them, embedding the rhythm of the gardens, the fragrance of roses, and the serene cadence of night into dreams that would linger until dawn. The orangery at Versailles rested quietly beneath a sky dusted with stars, its tall windows reflecting the silver light of the moon. Rows of potted citrus trees lined the interior, their glossy leaves glimmering faintly, and the faint scent of orange blossoms mingled with the earthy aroma of soil. The apprentices moved softly along the gravel paths outside, Etienne guiding them with deliberate steps, his voice low and reverent, as though disturbing the stillness would awaken the secrets held by centuries of careful cultivation. Inside, the orangery was a sanctuary of calm. Each tree was meticulously nurtured, branches trained along supports, fruits ripening in careful symmetry, and roots tended with subtle skill. Etienne encouraged apprentices to notice the delicate balance between human care and natural growth. How each pruning, each gentle adjustment contributed to the overall harmony of the space. Apprentices learned that patience was measured not in minutes, but in seasons, as the trees unfolded slowly over years beneath attentive hands. Soft moonlight filtered through tall windows, casting elongated shadows across the terracotta pots and stone paths. Apprentices knelt beside individual trees, tracing veins of leaves, observing the curvature of branches, and noting subtle variations in color. Etienne spoke of quiet observation, teaching that mastery required attunement to the living rhythm of each plant, understanding its needs, its strengths, and the delicate interplay between soil, water, light, and care. Every leaf and fruit became a teacher in itself, offering lessons in patience, attentiveness, and gentle guidance. The apprentices moved slowly through the orangery, pausing beside citrus trees heavy with small, ripening oranges. Etienne explained how pruning, support, and careful placement allowed the trees to flourish, ensuring fruit was balanced, leaves aligned, and the overall composition pleasing to eye and mind. Apprentices learned to adjust stakes, remove dead leaves, and gently reshape branches without forcing, understanding that the orangery thrived under subtle, thoughtful interventions rather than abrupt or hurried actions. Night deepened, and the air grew cool, carrying the faint scent of blossoms that had opened with the moon. Apprentices observed the interplay of shadows and light, noticing how the glow of lanterns mingled with moonlight to reveal textures otherwise invisible in daylight. Etienne reminded them that the night offered opportunities for reflection and learning, how plants reacted to light, how the scent of blossoms heightened awareness, and how quiet observation fostered deeper understanding of the balance between human care and nature's rhythm. Along the central avenue of the orangery, apprentices knelt to study small clusters of leaves, tracing the subtle curves and textures that signaled health, growth, or stress. Etienne encouraged them to move slowly, breathe softly, and allow their senses to attune to the space. The orangery, he said, was a living classroom, offering lessons in rhythm, proportion, and respect for life itself. Apprentices realized that mastery required humility, as each tree, branch, and fruit held wisdom beyond immediate understanding. Soft murmurs of water from hidden channels in the orangery added to the serene atmosphere. Apprentices observed reflections in shallow basins, watching how light danced on rippling surfaces and illuminated leaves. Etienne spoke of harmony, teaching that the sound of flowing water complemented the visual rhythm, creating a multi-sensory understanding of the garden's design. Apprentices learned that every detail, from soil texture to leaf alignment, from scent to sound, was part of a larger orchestration of care, observation, and intention. Toward the far end of the orangery, apprentices noticed a small alcove where lemon trees clustered, their branches bowing slightly under ripening fruit. Etienne guided them to kneel, observe, and make subtle adjustments, removing leaves that blocked light, guiding branches along supports, and ensuring that fruit received adequate exposure. Apprentices felt the quiet joy of gentle influence, understanding that skill was expressed in subtlety, and that the smallest interventions could transform growth without dominating or forcing nature's course. The apprentices continued through the orangery, moving slowly, observing shadows, textures, scents, and subtle movements of leaves in the soft night breeze. Etienne reminded them that attention to detail was not just labor, but meditation, a quiet communion with living things that nurtured both the gardener and the garden. Apprentices felt a growing awareness of the delicate balance between care, observation, and natural rhythm. Before leaving, Etienne gathered the apprentices beneath the high glass windows, where moonlight spilled across leaves and paths. They listened to the whispers of leaves, the soft hum of distant water, and the faint rustle of soil as the trees settled in the night. He spoke softly of legacy, teaching that the orangery was a culmination of generations of care, patience, and knowledge, and that their quiet attentiveness carried forward the rhythm and wisdom of those who came before. Apprentices understood that every gesture, no matter how small, contributed to an enduring harmony, and that true mastery was born from observation, patience, and reverent care. As they exited into the cool night, apprentices felt the soft scent of blossoms linger, the gentle hum of leaves echo in their minds, and the quiet pulse of the orangery resonate in their hearts. Etienne encouraged them to carry the lessons into sleep, reflecting on patience, alignment, and the subtle dialogue between human attention and living nature. Dreams that night were filled with winding paths, glimmering fruits, and the serene rhythm of trees under moonlight, instilling a deep calm and the gentle cadence of Versailles' secret nocturnal life. Beneath the grand marble terraces of Versailles, a quiet world of shadows and stone awaited the apprentices. Etienne led them carefully down narrow stairways, the faint echo of their footsteps blending with the distant murmur of fountains above. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and old stone, a reminder that beneath the beauty of terraces and gardens lay another layer of care, history, and hidden labor. The apprentices moved slowly along subterranean corridors, observing arches and niches carved centuries before. Etienne explained that the terraces were more than decoration. They were structural masterpieces, holding gardens, fountains, and paths above while concealing passages, storage, and channels for water below. Apprentices noticed small drains and channels, subtle lines etched in stone, and gaps where light from above barely touched the marble floor. Learning that the elegance above was inseparable from precision and foresight beneath. Lantern light glimmered on stone walls, revealing subtle carvings and inscriptions left by generations of gardeners and masons. Etienne spoke softly of legacy, reminding apprentices that every terrace, stairway, and chamber had been shaped by attentive hands, careful measurement, and deep knowledge of materials and environment. Apprentices ran fingers along the smooth marble, feeling the cool pulse of centuries, and sensing the patience, skill, and reverence of those who had built and maintained this hidden world. They paused beside a hidden water channel, its surface glinting faintly under lantern light. Etienne explained that water from fountains above traveled through carefully concealed aqueducts beneath the terraces, feeding fountains, irrigation systems, and reflecting pools. Apprentices knelt to observe the flow, noting the precision of alignment and gentle gradient, understanding that these hidden channels were vital to the harmony of gardens above. They learned that mastery required attention to unseen forces, to subtle mechanisms that sustained visible beauty. As they continued, Etienne guided them to small storage chambers where tools, seeds, and materials were kept. Apprentices noticed the order, careful placement, and thoughtful labeling, understanding that the quiet rhythm of preparation beneath the terraces enabled effortless work above. Each object seemed to carry the whispers of gardeners who had come before, their intentions, care, and daily labor preserved in the subtle arrangement of implements and containers. In narrow passages, apprentices observed the echo of water and footsteps, feeling the living pulse of the space. Etienne encouraged them to move slowly, to notice sounds, vibrations, and reflections in the marble walls, teaching that the terraces were not only structural but sensory. Every step, every shift in weight, produced subtle resonance that echoed the careful balance between human craft and natural material. Apprentices discovered that observation extended beyond sight. It encompassed hearing, touch, and intuition, fostering a deeper understanding of the hidden world beneath their feet. Toward the far end of the underground corridors, the apprentices reached small vaults where plant specimens, bulbs, and delicate seeds were stored. Etienne explained how preservation of these living treasures required controlled temperature, careful attention to moisture, and gentle handling. Apprentices felt the weight of responsibility, understanding that gardens above were sustained by quiet labor, foresight, and respect for life beneath the marble terraces. They learned that true mastery extended beyond tending visible beauty to include unseen preparation, care, and guardianship of life in all its forms. Soft murmurs of water and faint drafts of cool air accompanied the apprentices as they traced stone pathways, observing hidden channels, niches, and alcoves. Etienne spoke of continuity, patience, and the quiet discipline required to maintain both hidden and visible realms. Apprentices realized that Versailles' grandeur relied equally on subtle, unseen systems as it did on fountains, terraces, and rose gardens. Every hidden conduit, carefully carved groove, and maintained tool was a testament to centuries of attentive hands shaping an enduring harmony. Before ascending to the terraces above, Etienne gathered the apprentices in a small, quiet chamber, its stone walls echoing softly. He spoke of interconnectedness, how the unseen world beneath supported the visible, how patience and attention to detail sustained beauty, and how care, observation, and mindfulness were the true measures of mastery. Apprentices felt a gentle reverence for the hidden labor, the quiet wisdom, and the centuries of craft embedded in stone, water, and earth. As they climbed back to the moonlit terraces, the apprentices noticed a subtle shift in perception. The grandeur above was no longer separate from the hidden chambers below. They understood that every fountain, hedge, and flower bed rested on a foundation of patience, skill, and unseen care. Night wrapped the gardens in stillness, and apprentices carried the quiet rhythm of the terraces beneath, embedding lessons of harmony, observation, and reverent attention deep into their hearts. Ready to dream beneath the stars of Versailles, the Grand Canal of Versailles lay still under a sky streaked with silver moonlight. Its waters mirrored the arches of distant bridges, the the trimmed hedges of gardens and the faint glimmer of lanterns along gravel paths. Etienne led the apprentices along the gently sloping banks, their footsteps soft on gravel, each sound merging with the whisper of water and rustle of night air. The night felt vast, expansive, and silent, holding the reflection of stars, statues, and the meticulous work of centuries in its calm surface. Apprentices paused frequently, kneeling at the canal's edge to observe the mirrored reflections of trees and arches. Etienne spoke softly of symmetry and perception, teaching that water offered a lens through which the gardens revealed subtle truths. Ripples, he explained, distorted lines slightly, revealing hidden alignments or inconsistencies, reminding the observers that mastery required patience, careful observation, and an understanding that even small imperfections held lessons. The air was fragrant with evening blossoms, dew resting gently on leaves and grass. Apprentices ran fingers across smooth stones along the canal's edge, noticing textures, temperatures, and faint vibrations of flowing water. Etienne encouraged them to breathe slowly, allowing the rhythm of night and the gentle flow of the canal to guide awareness. Each reflection, shadow, and shimmer became a teacher, revealing harmony, imperfection, and subtle beauty that daylight often obscured. Lanterns cast pools of golden light along the gravel banks, blending with moonlight to create an interplay of shadow and silver. Apprentices moved quietly, observing how reflections elongated, shifted, and merged with the real forms of trees and arches. Etienne reminded them that perception was fluid, influenced by angle, light, and observer position, and that understanding required patience and repeated attention. The canal became a mirror not only of gardens above, but of the apprentices' growing awareness, their capacity to see deeply and perceive subtly. They continued along winding paths lined with clipped hedges, pausing beside statues reflected in the water. Etienne spoke of quiet observation, teaching that shadows, reflections, and stillness revealed as much as form and color. Apprentices noted how statues appeared taller or bowed, how paths seemed to stretch endlessly, and how ripples created a dialogue between solid form and fleeting movement. The night became an immersive lesson in alignment, perception, and gentle attentiveness. In small alcoves along the canal, fountains whispered softly, their water catching both moonlight and lantern glow. Apprentices knelt beside shallow basins, observing movement, reflections, and gentle vibrations. Etienne explained that harmony required understanding both above and below. The ripple of water, the placement of stones, and the alignment of paths were as crucial as trimmed hedges, blooming flowers, and fountains spray. Each action, no matter how subtle, contributed to the overall rhythm and aesthetic of Versailles. The apprentices observed fish stirring beneath the canal surface, their movements tracing patterns in the reflected light. Etienne encouraged reflection, explaining that life in the canal, though small, mattered. It interacted with water, soil, and garden in subtle ways. Apprentices realized that attentiveness extended beyond human labor to the entire ecosystem, that respect and observation were necessary to maintain balance, beauty, and harmony. Along the western banks, a small grove of trees cast long shadows over the water. Apprentices paused to sketch shapes in the gravel, tracing reflections and imagining invisible lines connecting statues, fountains, and arches across the canal. Etienne reminded them that geometry, rhythm, and perspective were woven into every element, visible or hidden, teaching that observation and care were intertwined with understanding and patience. As midnight deepened, the apprentices gathered beneath an arched bridge, listening to water, wind, and faint nocturnal whispers. Etienne spoke of reflection in both water and mind, urging the apprentices to internalize the rhythm of night, the gentle movement of water, and the serene cadence of the gardens. Apprentices felt a growing connection to Versailles, sensing its quiet pulse, the legacy of centuries, and the delicate balance maintained by attentive hands and patient observation. Before returning to the cottages, the apprentices lingered, breathing deeply, observing the stillness of the canal, the gentle ripple of water, and the moonlight glimmering on leaves and stone. Etienne reminded them that mastery was not only in labor, but in perception, patience, and gentle attention. Dreams that night were imbued with silver reflections, quiet ripples, and the serene understanding that the gardens and canal, like life itself, unfolded with subtlety, rhythm, and enduring beauty. The first whispers of dawn crept softly into the orangery, brushing leaves of citrus trees with a pale golden light. Dew clung to the glossy surfaces of leaves and branches, catching the fragile rays and turning each droplet into a tiny prism. Apprentices moved silently along gravel paths, Etienne guiding them with gentle gestures, reminding them that morning revealed subtleties unseen under moonlight or midday sun. Inside, the orangery was alive with quiet energy. Citrus trees, carefully trained along wooden supports, reached toward the skylights, their branches adorned with budding flowers and ripening fruit. Etienne encouraged the apprentices to observe how leaves shifted in the gentle morning breeze, how petals unfolded slowly, and how subtle variations in light revealed textures and forms that required close attention. Apprentices knelt beside individual trees, tracing veins in leaves, feeling the softness of petals, and noticing tiny insects performing their quiet morning duties. Soft sunlight filtered through the glass panes, casting elongated shadows along terracotta pots and stone paths. Apprentices noted the delicate dance of light and shadow, how it revealed imperfections and highlighted beauty in equal measure. Etienne spoke of alignment, proportion, and patience, emphasizing that every adjustment, every pruning, every support, every touch was part of a broader dialogue with nature. Mastery, he said, required observation, restraint, and respect for the rhythm of growth. Along winding avenues, apprentices observed subtle differences among trees. Some leaves reflected light with a silvery sheen, while others absorbed warmth in darker tones. Etienne encouraged careful measurement and reflection, demonstrating that subtle deviations required gentle correction rather than abrupt interference. Apprentices learned to appreciate the nuances, understanding that the orangery thrived under attentive, thoughtful, and deliberate care. Small basins of water reflected the awakening sky, creating shimmering mirrors that illuminated leaves and flowers from below. Apprentices knelt beside these basins, tracing reflections, and noting the alignment of branches and foliage. Etienne explained that water, light, and growth were inseparable, that harmony depended upon balance between these elements, and that observation extended beyond physical labor into mindfulness, patience, and reverence. The scent of citrus blossoms filled the air, mingling with earthy aromas of soil and stone. Apprentices inhaled deeply, noticing how fragrance shifted along the paths, guiding their attention and enhancing perception. Etienne reminded them that every sense contributed to understanding. Sight, touch, smell, and intuition worked together to reveal hidden truths. Apprentices discovered that quiet attention cultivated not only skill, but a gentle attunement to the living rhythms of the orangery. Towards the far end, lemon trees leaned slightly under the weight of ripening fruit. Etienne guided apprentices in subtle adjustments, reshaping branches along supports, removing small leaves that blocked light, and ensuring fruit received balanced exposure. Every gesture was deliberate, precise, and gentle, emphasizing harmony rather than domination. Apprentices felt the joy of quiet influence, understanding that careful care shaped growth without forcing nature's course. In small alcoves, orange trees glimmered with dew-laden leaves, their scent delicate and intoxicating. Apprentices observed the soft undulation of branches in the morning breeze, listening to faint rustles and noting vibrations in the soil. Etienne spoke softly of rhythm and patience, teaching that attentive observation was a practice of mindfulness, and that every interaction left a subtle imprint on the garden, shaping its ongoing growth and harmony. As the sun rose higher, the orangery glowed with gentle warmth. Apprentices moved slowly along paths, absorbing lessons in alignment, proportion, and care. Etienne encouraged reflection, urging them to internalize observations, consider the long arc of seasons and growth, and recognize that mastery required both patience and empathy. Every leaf, blossom, and fruit became a teacher, revealing the interconnectedness of effort, observation, and natural rhythm. Before leaving, apprentices gathered beneath the skylights, watching sunlight glinting across leaves and fruit. Etienne reminded them that every day in the orangery offered new lessons. Subtle shifts in growth, light, and scent revealed insights into patience, attentiveness, and quiet mastery. Apprentices carried the serene rhythm of morning into their hearts, embedding the lessons of observation, reverence, and gentle care deep within their awareness. As twilight settled over Versailles, the gardens took on a serene, muted glow, the sun's last rays spilling gently across marble statues, trimmed hedges, and winding paths. Apprentices wandered slowly along the avenues, Etienne guiding them with quiet patience, encouraging observation of the subtle changes that occurred as day shifted toward night. Shadows lengthened, blending with the soft glimmer of lanterns, and the air grew fragrant with evening blossoms. The apprentices paused beside reflective pools, kneeling to trace the mirrored images of trees, statues, and the fading sky. Etienne spoke softly of perspective, teaching that observation revealed not only visual beauty, but also the harmony of rhythm, proportion, and alignment. Apprentices noticed subtle shifts in reflection as wind rippled the water, realizing that even the smallest movement carried lessons in attentiveness, patience, and gentle understanding. Lanterns along gravel paths cast soft circles of light, mingling with lingering twilight. Apprentices moved carefully, noting how illumination altered perception, how shadows fell across hedges, and how subtle lines created patterns only visible when eyes were patient and attentive. Etienne reminded them that beauty was inseparable from careful observation, and that evening offered a distinct perspective often hidden in the brightness of day. Along avenues lined with rose bushes, apprentices inhaled the mingling scents of blossoms and earth, noticing how fragrance shifted as the air cooled. Etienne spoke of rhythm, teaching that sensory perception was integral to understanding gardens fully. Sight, smell, touch, and intuition combined to reveal subtleties otherwise invisible. Apprentices felt the quiet joy of deep observation, learning that harmony arose from attention, mindfulness, and reverent care rather than hurried action. Soft rustling of leaves accompanied their steps, each sound amplified in the evening stillness. Etienne encouraged apprentices to listen carefully, to trace movements of air and leaves, and to consider how sound reflected harmony and imbalance alike. Apprentices discovered that even faint vibrations, gentle whispers of wind, and the quiet settling of soil offered lessons in observation, patience, and awareness, extending understanding beyond the visual to the full sensory experience of the gardens. They paused beneath a row of statues, their forms elongated by the low sun, mirrored in nearby water channels. Etienne spoke of legacy, explaining that generations of gardeners had shaped the grounds with care, patience, and quiet discipline. Apprentices felt the weight of continuity, recognizing that every hedge trimmed, every flower bed arranged, and every fountain maintained was part of a centuries-long dialogue between human hands and living nature. Moving toward the Grand Canal, apprentices noticed the water's surface darkening as night approached, reflections deepening into hues of blue and silver. Etienne taught that alignment, balance, and proportion were not merely visual concerns, but encompassed the entire experience of garden life. Observing subtle patterns, shadows, and reflections, apprentices learned that mastery involved perception, patience, and thoughtful engagement with both visible and unseen elements. The scent of orange blossoms drifted softly from the orangery, mingling with the cool evening air. Apprentices traced pathways along the canal, observing ripples, reflections, and shadows, noting how subtle interactions between water, light, and plant life shaped perception and understanding. Etienne reminded them that attention to these subtleties cultivated patience, skill, and harmony, qualities essential to both gardens and life itself. As night deepened, lanterns cast gentle glows along paths, and the apprentices gathered beneath a quiet grove, listening to the soft hum of water, the rustle of leaves, and faint nocturnal whispers. Etienne spoke of reflection and mindfulness, urging them to internalize the rhythm, beauty, and harmony they had witnessed. Apprentices felt a serene connection to the gardens, a deep understanding of care, observation, and the delicate interplay of light, shadow, and movement. Before retreating to their cottages, apprentices lingered near a fountain, observing its gentle arc and mirrored pools. Etienne encouraged them to carry the lessons of evening contemplation into rest, reflecting on patience, attentiveness, and harmony. Dreams that night were imbued with subtle movement, gentle reflections, and the quiet rhythm of Versailles gardens, leaving apprentices with a sense of calm, understanding, and serene wonder. The first light of dawn bathed Versailles in gentle gold, as if the gardens themselves were awakening slowly from a long, quiet dream. Apprentices rose early, their footsteps soft upon gravel paths, carrying the lessons of months, years, and generations. Etienne walked among them with measured calm, observing not only their movements, but their thoughts, understanding that mastery was not only in action, but in perception, patience, and the quiet rhythm of care. As the apprentices moved along the avenues, each hedge, fountain, and flower bed reflected centuries of dedication. Etienne spoke softly of legacy, explaining that the work of gardeners transcended time. Each trimmed leaf, aligned stone, and polished fountain was more than ornamentation. It was a continuation of a dialogue between human effort and living nature. Apprentices felt the weight and honor of this knowledge, understanding that they were caretakers of not only gardens but of history, memory, and beauty. Along the Grand Canal, waters mirrored trees, statues, and the faint morning light. Apprentices knelt beside the edge, observing subtle ripples and reflections, and Etienne reminded them that even small actions, moving a leaf, adjusting a plant, watching water flow, had enduring consequences. Every gesture was part of a larger system, connecting life, labor, and perception across time. The canal became a mirror not only of gardens, but of responsibility, mindfulness, and continuity. The orangery glimmered with dew-laden leaves, golden in the early sun. Apprentices moved among citrus trees and delicate blossoms, tracing veins, noting alignment, and observing growth. Etienne spoke of patience, emphasizing that nature required careful attention and gentle guidance. Apprentices understood that the visible beauty of gardens above depended entirely on invisible care, foresight, and respect for life beneath leaves and soil. Each seed, each bud, carried the imprint of attentive hands, creating a harmony that endured across centuries. In shaded groves and along winding paths, apprentices paused to reflect, inhaling the fragrance of blooms, feeling the texture of bark, and noticing the play of light on stone. Etienne encouraged them to integrate observation, intuition, and mindfulness, teaching that legacy was woven from quiet dedication, careful alignment, and reverent attention. Apprentices discovered that their own hands and thoughts were part of this living heritage, contributing to a continuum that stretched beyond their own lifetimes. They wandered beneath arches and statues, noticing small details often overlooked: inscriptions, subtle carvings, and footprints of past gardeners. Etienne explained that each subtle mark was a story, a record of care, choice, and mindful presence. Apprentices felt a deepening connection, realizing that Versailles was not merely a spectacle, but a living testament to generations of quiet labor, observation, and devotion. Every path, fountain, and terrace became a teacher, revealing lessons in patience, attentiveness, and continuity. As the sun rose higher, lanterns were replaced by natural light, and shadows shifted across fountains, hedges, and statues. Apprentices traced these movements carefully, learning to perceive harmony in both stillness and change. Etienne spoke of the balance between action and observation, teaching that gardens, like life, required patience, reflection, and gentle intervention. Apprentices understood that mastery was not rush or force, but careful, deliberate engagement with the living world around them. Near the grand terraces, apprentices gathered to observe the interplay of water, stone, and plants. Etienne reminded them that their work carried forward centuries of tradition, that every gesture of care was a thread in a larger tapestry. Apprentices felt the serene weight of this responsibility, yet also the quiet joy of contributing to something enduring, beautiful, and deeply human. They understood that legacy was not measured in grandeur alone, but in attention, mindfulness, and love for subtle perfection. In quiet moments beneath the marble terraces, apprentices knelt to touch cool stone, tracing the patterns and grooves left by hands long gone. Etienne encouraged them to imagine the gardeners who had walked these paths before, who had aligned fountains, planted seeds, and observed the pulse of gardens with gentle attention. Apprentices felt time converge, a soft continuum linking past, present, and future through care, observation, and mindful labor. As evening approached, the gardens glowed with amber light, shadows lengthening across fountains, pools, and hedges. Apprentices moved slowly, observing, reflecting, and internalizing the lessons of the day, the season, and the centuries. Etienne spoke softly of gratitude. Gratitude for knowledge passed down, for the living beauty of gardens, and for the opportunity to participate in a legacy that extended beyond any single lifetime. Apprentices felt a profound serenity, a calm understanding that their presence, care, and observation were part of an enduring rhythm. Finally, as twilight embraced the gardens, apprentices paused near the Grand Canal, watching reflections of the sky, trees, and statues shimmering in the still waters. Etienne spoke one last time of harmony, reverence, and continuity, urging the apprentices to carry these lessons into all aspects of life. They lay on soft grass, hands lightly touching earth, hearts attuned to the rhythm of water, stone, and leaves. In the gentle glow of evening, the apprentices understood the true legacy of the gardeners: patience, mindfulness, care, and an unbroken thread connecting all who tended, observed, and loved the gardens of Versailles. Night settled softly over the terraces, fountains, and groves, and the apprentices closed their eyes. Dreams carried reflections of flowing water, shimmering leaves, aligned hedges, and glowing marble. The legacy of the gardeners became a quiet lullaby, a gentle continuum of care and harmony, leaving the apprentices with serenity, wonder, and a deep, abiding sense of connection to the enduring beauty of Versailles.